currently an election year in America. Because of that, some of the same confusion that's typical of all election years has once again begun to rear its head. We at the Infrared Collective want to take this opportunity to clarify what we perceive are some of the most common confusions surrounding it among the left. Recently, Virgil Texas and Brianna Joy-Gray of the Bad Faith podcast hosted Noam Chomsky to have a debate about their significance. In one segment, Virgil argued that it doesn't matter if Trump wins or not, because if capitalism isn't overthrown in 10 years, the climate crisis will become irreversible. Chomsky responded by saying,
"Is there the remotest chance that within a decade or two we'll overthrow capitalism? It's not even a dream, okay?"
While we agree with the spirit of Virgil's position, obviously when you begin from there, Chomsky is right. Capitalism isn't going to be overthrown in the next 10 years, whatever that means, and no concrete position can be premised on the expectation that it will be. Instead, it's an abstract position that doesn't establish any meaningful relation to present political realities.
So the real question that you have to ask is this. Is Chomsky's position, which means voting for Biden as an individual, the only real concrete political position as it concerns the elections? While Chomsky might be right about the fact that basing your position on overthrowing capitalism is practically meaningless, the sense of self-satisfaction that comes with individually voting or canvassing is, from a practical perspective, equally meaningless, right? Similar to ultra-leftists, the important thing isn't the actual or concrete result of your position. It's its ability to fulfill a purely abstract criterion. Chomsky knows that his own vote, or the vote of people who listen to him, are not concretely decisive from a practical perspective. Yet he advocates for people to do this because he thinks that from an individual perspective, it's the most moral thing to do. It's what you need to do as a citizen.
What the position of Chomsky and the ultra-leftists have in common, something which Marxists in the past called the quality of petty bourgeois individualism. The petty bourgeoisie, in the context of this phrase, it typically referred to tendencies that prevailed among the conscientious middle class and professional classes. But the important thing, as Marx noted, is that the members of this class are unable to distinguish its special condition from the general condition on which the class struggle, or in this example, climate crisis, can be avoided. In this example, by fulfilling certain special, and in this case, purely individual conditions, such as voting, or by contrast, maintaining some ultra-leftist posture, the real and general conditions of ameliorating the contradictions they're pretending to respond to, which is the crisis they feel is at stake in the current elections, are somehow satisfied. The important thing here isn't the question of whether Biden provides the opportunity for leftists to solve problems in the first place. It's a question of how they're articulating their own practical relationship to these problems and the way these problems are mediated in the institutions, such as the electoral process in the first place.
What makes the way they are doing this so petty bourgeois? Sometimes the petty bourgeois refers to small-scale independent proprietors, but in the context of being a pejorative against the errors of leftists or socialists, it usually refers to the educated, professional, urban middle class. The very basis of this class's existences lie in the official institutions of civil society. They come to believe that there is no reality outside of these official institutions because, as individuals, they know no other reality. They come to think that by voting individually, they are participating in the real side of politics. Conversely, ultra-leftists think that by denying the reality of these institutions, they are participating in the actual abolition of real politics. This stems from the same error, which does not distinguish material reality from the institutions that officially mediate reality.
That's also why they view the current reality in a purely subjective way of problem solving or correcting moral wrongs. But it's not a material or objective perspective, but a purely subjective standpoint of institutions. It's a too big to fail mentality, held by Wall Street, for example, before 2008. They don't view institutions as part of a larger reality, but idealistically as the only reality. They don't perceive an objective contradiction, only one between abstract principles, or what's within the practical intervention of establishment institutions and the violation of these principles.
And at that point, it just becomes a matter of making a personal decision, based on the outcomes you would personally like to see happen. But what this takes for granted is how you perceive what you consider the problem in the first place, and the institutions that you've taken for granted as the vehicle for resolving them. Someone like this stops short of the recognition that you're an American citizen of American democracy, and that you feel some personal obligation to actively make a decision about the elections. And even when you decide not to vote, you still somehow, as a decision you had to make actively. This is because you don't see American democracy as having itself having its basis in a more fundamental reality and a more material reality than its own official institutions. If you did, you'd be able to perceive that the scope of your individual relationship to politics isn't exclusively defined by the institutions, but by a necessity that's drawn from a deeper sense of reality. You wouldn't feel a personal necessity to vote, or even to abstain. You recognize that the fact of being an American citizen in an American democracy does not exhaust your material and real relationship to politics in general.
This is actually something that the majority of American working class actually understands, which is why it's pretty laughable when people say that refusing to vote is privileged. The reason why so many ordinary and lower class Americans believe in conspiracy theories and don't vote is because they recognize deeper reality of politics that's utterly beyond the relationship that individual citizens have towards American political institutions. They recognize cabals, shadow governments, secret societies, the deep state, and well-connected establishments because they understand that they are part of the same political reality that's more fundamental than the one democratic institutions try to define for them. What's really unforgivable about this fact is that this was given to Bernie Sanders supporters on a silver platter, many of whom now campaign for Biden, both in the recent and 2016 primaries. In both of those cases, establishment voices treated the primaries as something objective and almost set in stone, and that the wishes of Bernie voters don't matter. And when both presidential election seasons finally come around, all of a sudden voting is no longer objective. It's no longer set in stone. It's something that demands immediate subjective will.
When we're using words like material or objective, we're not talking about some vulgar economic determinism. We're not saying there's no need to vote as an individual because of capitalism or something. We're saying there's no need to vote because of establishments. If you're an individual leftist or even former Bernie supporter, it should now be clear to you that you're not really the one who's decisive for winning elections. By personally voting or canvassing for Biden, you're just being a sucker. And to Bernie people now arguing for Biden, if Biden needs you specifically for him to win, then you would have already gotten Bernie to win the Democratic ticket. You should have better leveraged your position then instead of fantasizing about future scenarios like Nathan Robinson's doing now. If he doesn't need you, which may very well be possible, then why do you feel personally obligated to waste your time voting for him? Whether he wins or not won't be down to people like you. It's going to be down to factors that are utterly outside the sphere of your practical intervention. And all of that aside, you shouldn't feel compelled to create meaningless hypotheticals about choosing the lesser of two evils, because not even the Democrats do that. As we speak, they're holding up a bill that will provide some relief to people who really need it. How is giving people nothing at all the lesser of two evils in that case? The reason is obvious to anyone with a spine. There comes a certain point where you draw a line. If you don't, all you end up doing is submitting to whatever subjective authorities happen to prevail, at the expense of your own deeper sense of material reality.
And that's what this is really about. Of decisive importance now for leftists isn't voting, but acquiring a better sense of reality, a better sense of the objective and material necessity that compels you to identify with the causes you do. Because as of now, you don't have a deeper sense of material objectivity, what Mao called the primary contradiction of the class struggle. You have a purely subjective stance about right and wrong. The technocratic faith in current institutions subjects the environment. And keep in mind, none of this is about whether there's a reality to elections or whether organizations find it strategically important to participate in them for the purpose of acquiring power. But that's completely different from voting on a purely individual basis or voting because you want a big society. Rather than overthrowing the current institutions which you expect to do this and replacing them with a new people's power, a proletarian dictatorship. That's why Bosch's arguments that Lenin would vote for Biden are dishonest and opportunistic. For Lenin, the significance of voting isn't the same as the official one, which is to govern society. It's about establishing a concrete relationship to actual political realities and the people. That has nothing to do with voting as an individual because you want to see some policies enacted. What's at stake in the first place is how the objective conditions are given meaning in the first place. How does reality make sense for you in the first place? Right now, that's what we, the Infrared Collective, consider a pressing concern for leftists in America.
Something I got a feeling